with the question first before reading the case. That helps gain focus. And start with the end in mind to avoid extra information. So let's start with number 1. The pharmacist preparing the 2-in-1 PN uses potassium phosphate vials. 3 millimoles of phosphate and 4.4 milliequivalents of potassium are in each milliliter. And uses potassium phosphate vials to add the phosphate to the parenteral nutrition. How many milliequivalents of potassium are added to the parenteral nutrition when the phosphate is added? So let's go ahead and see what our requirements are. For 1, the requirements that we have are potassium 65 milliequivalents right here, and we see that we also have, let's look for our phosphate, 24 millimoles of phosphate up here. In other words, I would like to rewrite number 1. It says how many milliequivalents, how many, I can put X. So down here I will put X milliequivalents of potassium are added when the phosphate is added. Phosphate we are only getting from potassium phosphate, where we can get potassium from potassium chloride or potassium phosphate. Since the phosphate is limited to only one source, we will start with that one first. I personally like dimensional analysis, so here will be an example of solving using dimensional analysis. I'll also show it being solved using proportions. X milliequivalents of potassium, just like we had above. I'm just rewriting it here. X milliequivalents of potassium equals, and I'm going to start my dimensional analysis. So the way I do that is take the units that I'm looking for, and I want to repeat that. I want that in the numerator. So I look through my question and I find milliequivalents of potassium. I know that there are, according to the question, 4.4 milliequivalents of potassium per milliliter. So that's where I get this 4.4 milliequivalents of potassium over 1 ml of KPHOS. But my end result does not include this KPHOS, so I need to get rid of the milliliters of KPHOS. How can I do that? I look through my question again.
Well, guess what? This 3 millimoles phosphate is in the same milliliter that the 4.4 milliequivalents of potassium are in.
And I happen in the 3 millimoles of phosphate are in every 1 milliliter of KPHOS. I get to cross these out. But now I'm left with 3 millimoles of phosphate. How do I get rid of my phosphate? Well, it's going to take me back to my requirement that I met of phosphate, the 24 millimoles of phosphate. I can then cross out millimoles phos, and multiply all the numerators, divide all the denominators, and I come up with my answer.
32.5 milliequivalents of potassium from potassium phosphate.
Now what I did here was I solved the same problem using proportions instead. So I know that my requirement was 24 millimoles of phosphate. I want to know how many milliliters of potassium phosphate are in that.
And I set that up equivalent to the strength given to us in the question. 3 millimoles phosphate over 1 milliliter potassium phosphate. So now we have our proportion. We will cross multiply and divide. And we come up with an answer of 8 milliliters of potassium phosphate. This is the answer to number 2.
Easier. Move this down a little bit. I'm just rewriting X milliequivalents potassium, X milliequivalents of potassium. Here are the units that I'm trying to get, milliequivalents of potassium. So I'll search see if I can find any of those, or wherever it says milliequivalents of potassium. See if I can find milliequivalents of potassium. Guess what? Oh my gosh, I have some milliequivalents of potassium up here. Let's redo this whole thing. I'd like to solve this using dimensional analysis. I'll rewrite what the question said. I have milliequivalents of terms of a math problem. So I have X milliequivalents down at the bottom of potassium equals, then I want to start out with the same units that I'm looking for in my final product. So these are the units, milliequivalents of potassium, that I'm actually looking for. Right here, milliequivalents of potassium. So I find my milliequivalents of potassium in the question. In the question, I saw it right here, milliequivalents of potassium per ml. So I will rewrite 4.4 milliequivalents of potassium over 1 ml right here. But now that was 1 ml of potassium phosphate, but now I have this unit that I don't want anymore. I want to get rid of it. So where can I find it? I look back in the question, number 1. Possibly I might need to look in the case, but I'm looking to get rid of milliliters of K-phos. Write 1 ml of potassium phosphate on top so that it can be crossed out. 1 milliliter per 3 millimoles of phosphate is what I'm left with, but now I have this millimoles of phosphate that I need to do away with. Where can I find that? Well, looks like I'm going to need to find it in the requirement up on top. Millimoles of phosphate that are required are right here, 24. So I plug that in. I can cross out my units. If I multiply everything on top and divide everything on the bottom, I will come out with my answer. I'm double checking my units, that it's milliequivalents of potassium, which is what I want. When I enter that into the calculator, I wind up getting 35.2, which is in one of these slides here. 35.2 milliequivalents of potassium from K-phos. To prove to you that I did this correctly, I think I would like to show you another way, or solve using proportions. I can begin by setting up my requirement. I want to meet my requirement of millimoles of phosphate. 24 millimoles of phosphate are in how many milliliters of potassium phosphate? If I get my milliliters of potassium phosphate, then I will be able to find my milliequivalents of potassium. So I have 24 millimoles of phosphate over how many milliliters of potassium phosphate is equal to 3 millimoles of phosphate, which I got from the question up on the very top, over 1 milliliter of potassium phosphate. So we cross multiply and divide, and the answer that I get is 8 milliliters of potassium phosphate. Is that the unit that we are looking for, milliliters of potassium phosphate? No, it is not. We want to know milliequivalents of potassium. How many milliequivalents of potassium? So I can use the answer that I just got and write another proportion. So this is the alternate way instead of using dimensional analysis. Instead, I use two proportions. The answer that I got from the first proportion is 8 milliliters of K-phos. I'll rewrite it down here. In every 8 milliliters of K-phos, how many milliequivalents of potassium are there? So I put it over X milliequivalents potassium equals, I just match up, make sure that these units are exactly the same over here, milliliters of potassium phosphate, and I make sure that the units on the bottom are the same, milliequivalents of potassium. They are. And again, I got this number from the question itself, that there's 4.4 milliequivalents of potassium in every 1 ml of potassium phosphate. So now I cross multiply and divide. Guess what? I get the same answer, 35.2 milliequivalents of potassium from potassium phosphate. Let's look at number 2. How many milliliters of potassium phosphate are required? So now it's milliliters that we're looking for. And we're looking for potassium phosphate in order to meet the phosphate requirements. Let's see if we can answer that. A note that I'd like to make is that 35.2 milliequivalents of potassium isn't enough to meet the 65 milliequivalent potassium requirement. You can see the requirement in the formula up here. 65. Do you see potassium 65? Noted by the green dot. Since 35.2 milliequivalents of potassium isn't enough to meet the 65 milliequivalent potassium requirement, we need to add more, but we can't use any more K-phos. We added as much K-phos as we can without going over the phosphate requirement. Therefore, a different substance, in this case KCl, will be needed to add to fulfill the remaining potassium requirement. How do I find out how much more I need? How many more milliequivalents of potassium I need? I take the total requirement, 65 milliequivalents, minus what I got from K-phos, which was 35.2, and that will tell me the remaining that I need. I won't be able to supply that with K-phos. I'll have to use potassium chloride. Potassium chloride has 2 milliequivalents of potassium for every 1 milliliter. I can do a simple proportion to find my answer. I use what I had remaining, and I plug it in here. So this is what I have in real life on the left-hand side of my equal sign. 29.8 milliequivalents of potassium, and I have X milliliters of what I want for potassium chloride is equal to 2 milliequivalents of potassium over 1 milliliter of potassium chloride. Where did I get this number? I got it from this right here. 2 milliequivalents of potassium went on top, and 1 milliliter went on the bottom. So now I cross multiply and divide. Answer to X milliliters equals 14.9 milliliters of potassium chloride. There we go. That's my answer to number